My name is Lucas Mendonça. I'm 26 years old, and I never imagined that opening a streaming app on the wrong profile would be the thing that changed everything. Amazon Prime was open on my roommate's account. Before I switched profiles, I saw his history. Gay romance movies. The very same movies he had declared, out loud and with a smirk, were total nonsense. I can tell you exactly how my body reacted. A sort of mild dizziness, as if the floor had shifted 2 centimeters down and no one else had noticed. A quiet disorientation, the kind that doesn't scream, it just throws everything off balance. I closed the app. I stood still for a few seconds that felt much longer than they actually were. This story doesn't start here. To understand what that history means, what it really means, you need to understand how I ended up in that room, who Tiago was before he became the person in that history, what was being built between us, slowly, without either of us ever naming what was happening. So let's go back, because this story deserves to be told right. Are you ready to explore this with me? I came to Arinos, a small town in northwestern Minas Gerais, about 15,000 people, for a reason I couldn't explain at the time, without sounding like I was making excuses. I needed silence. It wasn't burnout exactly. It was more like I had reached a point where São Paulo had become too loud for the internal volume I was already carrying. I was 25, working as a freelance graphic designer, the kind of job you can do from anywhere with a good internet connection. And I had just gotten out of a situation that occupied more space in my head than I wanted to admit. A situation involving someone I invested too much in, too quickly, without being sure the other side was willing to invest back. The kind of thing that teaches you, the hard way, the cost of projecting feelings onto someone who isn't ready to receive them. I needed distance. And distance, in Arinos, was one thing that wasn't lacking. I found the ad for the room for rent on a classified site. Simple, not too many photos, a fair price for the local standards. I reached out. The owner of the house replied within a few hours with short messages, not cold, just straightforward. We agreed that I'd see the room on a Thursday in September. Tiago Cavalcante opened the door, wearing a dark t-shirt and work pants, his hands still slightly stained with engine grease. He was 29, nearly 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with a way of moving that didn't waste energy on anything unnecessary. He greeted me with a firm handshake, not the kind of someone trying to impress, but the kind of someone who simply shakes people's hands, and showed me the house without beating around the bush. Living room, kitchen, shared bathroom, room in the back, window to the yard, ceiling fan. "Is the internet good?" I asked. "Fiber," he said. "It works. 2 words, no frills." I rented the room. Arinos is the kind of town where everyone's stories are semi-public knowledge. Within 2 weeks, I already knew what the town knew about Tiago, without even having to ask. Son of Mr. Cavalcante, who had passed away 2 years prior and left behind the auto shop that Tiago now ran alone. A trusted mechanic, the kind people went to for their own cars, but also recommended to family from out of town. A good son, a serious young man. He didn't get into trouble, didn't drink too much, wasn't one for gossip. He knew everyone worth knowing by name. Arinos's profile of Tiago was that of a man who operated exactly within the parameters the town considered right. A man from whom no one expected surprises. Someone who was, above all else, predictable, and who had cultivated that predictability with the care of someone who knows what happens when you stop being predictable in a place this size. I thought I understood him. It took me time to realize I was understanding the performance, not the man. For the first few months, our relationship was one of polite cohabitation. Dividíamos a cozinha, o banheiro, o horário da televisão. We'd cross paths in the kitchen in the morning and exchange basic pleasantries. "Good morning. How was it? There's coffee." Tiago wasn't one for small talk. I respected that. I learned the rhythm of the house, which was his rhythm. Organized, quiet, predictable in the way only the homes of people who have learned to be enough for themselves usually are. There was a specific silence the house held. Not an empty silence, but the silence of two people who had learned to take up little space so as not to bother anyone. Two strangers sharing the same roof, each with their own pile of internal baggage, keeping those piles out of the other's sight. It took time for me to realize I was starting to bother him anyway, in the right way. It wasn't just one thing. If it were one thing, maybe I could categorize it, put it in a mental box, close the lid, and keep moving. But it wasn't like that. It was a sequence of small things I unwittingly held on to, that kept accumulating into the kind of pile you only realize you were building when it topples over. The first was the coffee. Tiago used to wake up before me, every day. By 6 in the morning he was up, getting ready for the workshop. I'd wake up around 8 or 9. The great thing about remote work is that no one monitors your start time as long as the work gets done. During the first few weeks, when I went down to the kitchen, there was half a pot of coffee on the stove, but nothing else. Tiago had had his and left. At some point, I don't know exactly when, because there was no announcement, no ceremony. I started going down and finding a cup turned upside down on a plate next to the coffee maker, and the pot full. He was making coffee for me. He didn't say anything about it. I didn't either. I started drinking the coffee every morning and never asked if it was intentional, never thanked him in a way that would make the gesture a topic of conversation. It stayed like that, an unspoken ritual that established itself with the naturalness of things that belong to everyday life. But I held on to it. The second was the charger. One Sunday afternoon, I was working in my room when I realized my laptop charger had stopped working. I tested different outlets, restarted the machine, nothing. It really was the charger. A serious problem, because my Monday deadline was urgent, and the nearest town with an electronics store was an hour away. I spent some time in the room trying to fix it by other means, frustration slowly building. I put the laptop in my bag with the idea of dealing with it early the next day, using what was left of the battery, hoping I'd have enough time. The next morning, I woke up and went down for coffee. The charger was on the kitchen table with a note underneath, written on a torn piece of notebook paper in that firm, direct handwriting. Managed to fix it. Tiago. He had repaired the charger, without me asking, without me knowing how he even found out it was broken. To this day, I don't know if he heard my commotion in the room above while I was troubleshooting, or if he noticed when he passed by the hallway. I didn't ask, but I finished the work on time. I held on to that one too. Have you ever had someone do something like that for you, without being asked, without announcing it, without expecting you to notice, and you held it inside, not knowing what to do with it? The third was the night I came back late. One Wednesday, I had a video conference with a client in São Paulo, different time zone. The call lasted until almost midnight. When I finished, I went downstairs to get some water, my head still in meeting mode, and I came across the kitchen light on. Tiago was sitting at the table with a glass of juice, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I appeared in the hallway. "Everything okay?" he said. "Fine," I replied. "Meeting ran late." He nodded. He stayed for a little longer, in no rush, and then went to his room. I stood there in the kitchen, glass in hand, wondering why he was awake at that hour. Tiago went to bed early every day. He was the type to sleep at 10 and wake up at 6, invariably. He had said nothing was happening at the workshop. He hadn't mentioned any problems. I can't prove anything. But I also can't stop thinking that he was awake waiting for me to get home. Have you ever had someone look out for you like that? Through gestures, through presence, without ever putting it into words? Without asking for anything in return? Without expecting a thank you? Without even confirming they were doing it on purpose? It's a specific kind of attention. And it's the hardest kind to ignore, precisely because it gives you nothing to push back against. The most significant night was a Friday, 2 months after I arrived. Neither of us had planned anything. I was on the couch with the remote in hand, looking for something to watch, when Tiago came from the kitchen with 2 glasses of water and sat in the armchair next to me, without asking if I minded. I didn't mind. We sat watching television for over 2 hours. We didn't talk much, brief exchanges about what was on the screen, about nothing important. But there was something in that shared silence that was different from the usual silence of the house. Less distance, more presence. The kind of presence that doesn't need conversation to exist. Tiago went to his room around midnight. Before leaving the room, he turned and said, "Good night, Lucas," with my name. Not just good night. With my name, the way people say it when they're truly talking to you, not through you, not to the generic space of the room. I said good night back and stared at the television for another 10 minutes without seeing a thing. I held back. I contained myself with the disciplined awareness of someone who learned the hard way the cost of projecting feelings onto someone who isn't ready to receive them. Tiago was exactly the type of man I had learned not to let in. Not because he was bad, but because he was the type whose armor is so convincing that you believe in it, even when you don't want to. But it's hard to hold back when the gestures keep coming. I need to tell you about one specific night, because without this night, what comes next is merely surprising. With it, what comes next is devastating. It was about 3 weeks before the discovery. I was in the living room in the late afternoon. The workday had ended early, and I was watching a movie. One of those movies I like, a romance. 2 men, the kind of thing I find every now and then on streaming platforms that makes me feel like I'm not the only one in the world who exists this way. The kind of movie you watch with a sort of quiet relief, because there are stories we need to see to know that our own story can have an ending. I wasn't paying attention to the footsteps on the stairs. Tiago appeared at the living room entrance with a water bottle in his hand, on his way to the kitchen. He stopped. He looked at the screen for about 2 or 3 seconds, just enough time for someone's brain to process what it's seeing and identify it. I felt the moment he recognized what was playing. What happened next wasn't anger. Anger I could understand. Anger has a logic, an object, a target. What happened was something more complicated, and because of that, harder to deal with. It was discomfort, the kind that turns inward and outward at the same time. I saw Tiago's face change in a fraction of a second. I saw his shoulders pull back slightly, as if he needed to create distance between himself and the image on the screen. I saw an expression flicker for less than a second before being replaced by another. And it was that fraction of a second, that flash before the smile, that I couldn't stop thinking about later. And then he gave that half smile I'd learned to recognize as a performance. "What is this?" he said, not to me, but to the air. For no one in particular, like someone commenting on something so obvious, it didn't even need to be said. These kinds of movies are such garbage. It wasn't aggression, it was dismissal. A casual dismissal, spoken as if it were obvious, as if that were the only possible reaction for a normal man. As if watching that kind of movie was what needed an explanation, rather than the rejection of it. I felt myself smallen. Not the exact word, but the closest one. The feeling of shrinking without moving. I felt like I had done something wrong for liking what I liked, inside the house where I paid rent, during time that was mine. It's not for everyone, I said. My voice came out calmer than I expected. Tiago made a vague gesture with the water bottle, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, the gesture of someone closing a subject that doesn't deserve to be a subject, and went to the kitchen. He came back a while later and went up to the bedroom without passing through the living room again. I turned off the movie. Not because he asked. He didn't ask. But the pleasure had vanished anyway, replaced by a specific weight I knew well enough not to want to name. I sat on the dark sofa for a while, listening to the sounds of the house and the night outside. Thinking about that expression Tiago had, that fraction of a second before the smile, when his eyes landed on the screen. What was that? Discomfort from seeing something that genuinely bothered him, or discomfort of another nature, the kind that arises when you see something you recognize, and the recognition itself is the problem? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I tucked the question into a mental drawer and locked it. 3 weeks later, Amazon Prime opened that drawer for me. Have you ever had a memory come back with a completely different meaning? Not because it changed, it's exactly the same. The words are the same. The sequence of events is the same. But because what you know has changed, and this new knowledge recolors everything, it's disorienting. It's like looking at an old photograph and seeing something that was there all along. Something you simply hadn't seen because you didn't know what to look for yet. That's exactly how I went back to that night after seeing the history. Tiago had stopped at the living room entrance. He had looked at the screen for 2-3 seconds, and what I interpreted as discomfort, that microsecond of an expression before the smile, might have been recognition. It might have been a man seeing himself reflected in a place where he didn't expect to be caught. And then he put up his armor. Fast. With practice. With the efficiency of someone who has raised that armor so many times that the movement is already automatic. A reflex, not a decision. I don't know if that's it. I don't know for sure. But after seeing the history, it's impossible not to wonder. Let's go back to that Tuesday afternoon. I was on the sofa, remote in hand, the app open on Tiago's profile by mistake, the history loading on the screen. Let me tell you what really happened. Not just the facts, but the internal process. Because the process is the part no one tells you about. It's the part that happens inside, in silence, while on the outside, you're just sitting in an ordinary living room at the end of an ordinary afternoon. At first, I didn't immediately understand what I was seeing. It was like when you read a sentence and the words arrive before the meaning. You see the symbols, but the brain is still processing. I saw the titles. I recognized the titles. But for 2 or 3 seconds, I didn't make the connection. The brain needs an extra moment when what it's seeing doesn't match the model it built. When I did, I stopped breathing. It's not an exaggeration. It's literally what happens when information arrives too big. The body pauses, as if it needs an extra second to allocate space for it. A beat of internal silence before any reaction organizes itself. The titles were there. At least 6 or 7 movies in the recently watched section. All of them the kind I know. Stories of romance between men. The kind of thing that isn't hard to recognize from the thumbnail and title when you're familiar with it. And in the recent searches, more terms. Terms that made it clear it hadn't been an accident. That there was intent, repetition, a deliberate search. Not a wrong click. A choice, made more than once. The dates. That was what held my attention longer than anything else. The dates. The most recent movies had been watched within the last week. It wasn't months ago during a different period of life, nor years ago when Tiago was another version of himself. It was now. It was the Tiago of today. The Tiago I saw every morning in the kitchen. The Tiago who had said with that crooked smile that those kinds of movies were just too much nonsense. It was this Tiago. The same one. No gap. No alternative version. I closed the app. I stood there staring at the black TV screen, my own reflection on the dark surface vague, slightly distorted by the angle, present in a way that felt strange at that moment. Then I looked out the window. The backyard, the guava tree in the back, the brick wall, the perfectly normal world outside, going on without knowing a thing. I opened the app again. I have to say this. I opened it again because I needed to confirm I hadn't made it up. It wasn't morbid curiosity. It was the need to verify that reality was what it seemed to be. Like when you read a message 3 times because your brain refuses to accept what's written. Like when you double take at a traffic sign because what you read the first time couldn't be right. It was there, exactly as it was before. I closed the app a second time. I placed the remote in the exact same position it was in before, on the arm of the couch, carefully, as if the remote's geometry could keep something under control. As if the order of physical things around me could compensate for the internal disorder that was beginning. I got up. I went to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed. I stared at the opposite wall for an amount of time I can't quantify. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been 30. There wasn't a single complete thought. There were fragments, pieces of information I was trying to fit together without having the full picture. That night, Tiago returned from the shop at his usual time around 7 in the evening. I heard the door open, heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard the kitchen faucet turn on and off as he washed his hands. The normal ritual, the unshakable routine of a man who came home every day at the same time and did the same things in the same order. He knocked lightly on my door. "Lucas, there's leftover rice from yesterday if you want some." "Thanks," I said. "I'll be right down." His voice was completely normal. It came out completely normal. The words were just right, the tone at its usual volume. I didn't know whether to be proud or scared of my own ability to sound as if nothing had happened. I went down, served my plate, and ate sitting on the opposite side of the table while Tiago read something on his phone. The conversation was about the food, about the day, about nothing. Tiago told me a cold front was coming. It was going to cool down a few degrees by the end of the week. I said I didn't believe it, that the heat felt permanent. He gave a crooked smile, the little smile I knew. And I kept looking at that face which I'd known for almost 4 months, which had made me coffee every morning, which had fixed my charger without being asked, and I felt like I was seeing a different person superimposed over the one I knew. Not different in the sense of being a stranger, different in the sense of being more layers, more depth. A depth he had dedicated himself to keeping invisible, with competence and consistency, and that a 2-second slip-up on an app had laid bare without him knowing. I finished dinner, washed my plate, said goodnight, and went to my room with my head full of questions I didn't yet know if I had the right to ask. In the days that followed, something happened that I didn't expect. I began to reread the past. Not on purpose. It was involuntary. The kind of review the mind does without asking permission when it receives information that changes the angle of everything. Coffee every morning. Why would a man with such a precise routine bother leaving coffee for a tenant who wakes up 3 hours later without announcing it, without asking for thanks? The charger fixed without me asking. The kitchen light on at midnight, at a time that was never his. I had put all that on a shelf of things that were simply kind, and kind they were. But there was something more, a specific targeted attention that I had refused to see as targeted, because seeing it would be dangerous. Because Tiago was exactly the kind of man I had learned not to let in. Not because he was bad, but because he was the type whose armor is so convincing that you believe in it, even when you don't want to. The type who says those kinds of movies are nonsense and gives a crooked smile, and you accept the smile as the final word instead of asking what's underneath. Have you ever done that? Accepted someone's armor as if it were their true face, because it was easier to believe that than to insist on looking deeper. Because looking deeper requires you to also expose yourself, to also risk something. I had done that with Tiago for months, and now the history had shown that beneath the armor was a man who spent his nights watching the movies he had declared, right in front of me, were the biggest load of nonsense in the world. But there was a problem with what I knew. Confirming internally what that history meant was one thing. Acting on it was another. Because what I knew without permission. He hadn't intended to show me, and forcing a conversation he hadn't chosen to have before he was ready was a risk I knew well enough to respect. I'd arrived too early in a similar situation before. I knew the cost, so I held back. I went to work meetings. I turned in projects on time. I ate breakfast. I said goodnight. I lived within the rhythm of the house as if nothing had changed. But there was a cost to that too. The tension between what I knew and what I could say grew slowly. The kind of increase you don't notice until it's too late to pretend you're not feeling it. Like atmospheric pressure shifting. You don't notice while it's happening. You notice when your ears pop. Tiago noticed before I even realized there was something to notice. On a Thursday night, Tiago caught me red-handed in silence. I was on the sofa, laptop on my lap, pretending to work, which is what you do when your head isn't in the work, but the work needs to be in your head. The television was on without volume, meaningless images flickering by. Tiago had arrived from the shop, showered, and come downstairs. He sat in the armchair with his usual glass of juice. We stayed like that for a while. Him scrolling through his phone, me pretending to type. The low hum of the television filling the space between us. Until he set his phone down on the coffee table, slowly, and said without preamble, "You're different." It wasn't a question. It was an observation. The kind Tiago made after thinking before speaking, which was always. He wasn't one to say things without processing them first. I looked up from my laptop. "Different how?" I said. "I don't know. Different." He leaned his head against the back of the armchair and looked at me with that look I could never quite decipher. Direct, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and no intention of using it for anything else but that. "You're quieter." "I'm always quiet." "You're quiet in a different way than usual." I closed the laptop. There was something in the conversation moving toward a place I hadn't planned on going. And at the same time, there was something, it shames me to admit, but it's true, that I wanted to let go. Like a door you haven't decided to open, but you're not moving to close either. "Sometimes your head just gets heavy," I said. It wasn't a lie. "Because of work?" "Partly." Tiago stared at me for a second. Then he said, slowly, with the weight of someone choosing their words carefully, "You're thinking about leaving?" That wasn't a question either. It was another observation. And there was something in his voice, so subtle I might have imagined it, that sounded as if the answer mattered more than he was letting on. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Sometimes I think about it." "Arinos isn't for everyone," he said. "Small towns have their problems." "What kind of problems?" He was silent for a moment. He looked at the silent television, where some cooking show was playing without sound or context, then looked back at me. "The kind that comes up when people know you too well," he said. "When they think they know you too well. When there's nowhere to be, something they didn't expect of you." I felt the weight of those words land. These weren't the words of someone talking about Arinos in general, about small towns as an abstract concept, or country life as a common complaint. They were the words of someone talking about himself, in code. The code of someone who had learned to disguise the personal as the general, because the personal is too dangerous to appear without a veil. "It must be hard," I said carefully, with the kind of care you use when you don't want to startle something that is approaching slowly. "That's how it is," he said, in the level voice he used when he didn't want me to see any deeper. That's when his phone rang. I saw the change even before he answered, a nearly invisible tightening of his shoulders, the way his face adjusted, his posture reorganizing in a fraction of a second. The voice that came out was different. "Hi, Mom, I'm home." A pause. "No, I've already eaten." "Okay, I'll call you tomorrow." He took the call and ended it in less than a minute. But in that 1 minute, the man sitting in the armchair had been replaced by another. His posture was different. His voice was different. His presence, the way he occupied the space, was different. Donna Hilda Cavalcante, 58 years old. The woman everyone in Arinos knew, who moved through the city's daily life with the ease of someone who belongs to it completely. Who guarded the family image with the precision of someone who understands that reputation is an inherited asset requiring constant preservation. A good woman, I have no doubt about that. But good in the way that sometimes suffocates without meaning to, because her love and her expectations occupied the same space inside Tiago, without her noticing the difference between the two. Tiago hung up. He stared at the phone for a second that felt longer than it was. "Your mother," I said, unnecessarily. "Yeah." He stood up, with the movement of someone ending something before it gets too deep. "I'm going to bed early tonight. Big day tomorrow." "Good night, Tiago." He stopped at the living room entrance. He looked at me, just for a second direct, without looking away. With that look I could never quite decipher, but never stopped trying to. After a moment he said, "Good night, Lucas." He was gone. I stayed on the couch, listening to his footsteps going up the stairs, thinking about what had happened in that 1-minute call, how a person can change their voice, their posture, their expression in a matter of seconds. How the weight of what needs to be hidden can be carried with such competence that most people don't even realize something is being carried. The conversation had ended without a resolution, but the air in the room wasn't the same anymore, and I knew with the certainty that doesn't need confirmation to be real that something was going to happen, that it wasn't possible to continue in that state of suspense for much longer, that the pressure had reached a point where one thing or another was going to give. 3 days later, I did something I hadn't planned. Or maybe I had planned it without letting myself know. It was 10 at night, and I was passing by Tiago's workshop on my way to the only market in town that stayed open late. The lights in the workshop were on. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. The sliding door was cracked open, not the kind of cracked open that comes from carelessness, but the kind that's intentional for ventilation when the heat inside is more than the AC can handle. I saw Tiago's shadow moving inside, heard the metallic clang of a tool, the sound of an engine being tested, the creak of something being adjusted. He was working late at night in a town that went to bed early. I could have kept going to the market. I went in. "Hey," I said from the entrance. Tiago looked up from under the hood of an old car model I didn't recognize, from a time before mine. He didn't seem surprised to see me there, more like someone who had been expecting it and was watching that expectation come true in a way he hadn't exactly planned either. "Lucas," he said. "What's up?" "I was just passing by. Saw the light on." I took another step inside. "Working late?" The owner needs the car tomorrow morning. He wiped his hands on a thick rag and leaned against the side of the car, crossing his arms over his chest with the ease of someone on their own turf. Come in. Shut out the wind. I went in. The sliding door remained cracked open behind me. The workshop smelled of engine oil, heated metal, and a bit of old wax. The scent I had learned, over 4 months, to associate with Tiago the same way I associated breakfast with him. It was his territory, the place where he was most completely himself, without the mediation of the house, without the mediation of the city outside, without the need to perform for anyone, because the only audience was the engine in front of him and the tools on the bench. I had noticed it the few times I'd passed the workshop during the day. Tiago functioned differently here. Looser, not more talkative. He was never much of a talker, but more present, more whole. The conversation started neutral, about the car, the job, how old cars sometimes take more work than new ones, because certain parts aren't made anymore, and you have to adapt what's available. Tiago spoke of engines the same way he spoke of anything he understood deeply, with an economy of words and absolute precision. No room for ambiguity, no wasted space. I listened. I contributed where I could, which wasn't much. And as I listened, I started reaching the point I knew I would reach. I was watching a movie the other day, I said, carefully, without rushing. One called Weekend. Have you heard of it? Tiago stopped. It wasn't a dramatic stop. It wasn't the stop of someone in a panic, or the reaction of someone caught off guard who doesn't know what to do with their body. It was the stop of someone who heard something they were both expecting and not expecting at the same time. A pause of recognition, the kind that happens when what you hear is also what you've been, on some level, waiting for. He stared at his hands, still holding the rag. Then he set the rag down on the workbench with a quiet motion. The silence lasted long enough to feel heavy. I didn't say anything else. I learned the hard way, at a real cost, that the most important silences are the ones you let linger. That filling the silence with words, when the silence is doing the work, is wasting what the silence was building. When Tiago spoke, his voice was low, not broken low. The voice of someone being careful with what they're about to say, because they've never said it before, and don't yet know what shape those words take when spoken aloud. How do you know about that movie? He asked. I saw the name somewhere. He looked at me, directly, without looking away. And in that look, there was a question that wasn't about the movie, that had never been about the movie. Lucas, he said. Tiago. Another silence. Shorter this time, with a different quality, not the tension from before, but something closer to recognition. 2 points in space, finding the right distance between each other. And then Tiago did something I didn't expect. He turned toward the workbench with his back to me, rested his hands on the wood worn by use, and stayed like that for a moment. His back turned, as if he needed that angle, not seeing me, without the exposure of being looked at while he spoke, to say what he was about to say. It's been a long time, he said, so low I had to be still to hear, that I've been holding on to things. I didn't speak. I'm not the type who talks much about what I feel, he continued. You already know that. A pause. But some things get too heavy to just keep inside. I took a step closer. The smell of motor oil and heated metal grew stronger, and I felt the residual heat from the workbench lamp. His territory, the scent I had learned to associate with his most honest self. Not too close. Just enough so he knew I was listening, that I wasn't going anywhere, that the space between us was safe on my side. I saw, I said, softly. with the kind of softness that doesn't diminish what's being said. It just takes the threat out of it. I didn't mean to see, but I did. Tiago stood still for a second. Then he turned slowly. There was no accusation in what I said, and he understood that. It wasn't a weaponized revelation. It wasn't ammunition. It was acknowledgement. The only kind that matters. The only kind that didn't require the other to defend themselves. We share the account, he said. We share it. Another silence. And then, very slowly, something in Tiago's face changed. It didn't crumble, not in the dramatic way movies show, not the sudden dissolution of someone who can finally be who they are. It was more subtle, like when a tense shoulder relaxes a millimeter. You barely see it, but you feel it. The tension redistributes, the weight shifts. I don't know how this works here, he said, gesturing slightly to the space between us, to the air between us that carried the weight of the conversation. In this town, with my mother the way she is, with everything that comes with it. I know, I said. You don't need to know yet. You don't need to name it. You don't need to have answers for anything we haven't chosen to ask today. He looked at me. But you feel it, I said. Not a question, an observation. In the same way, he had observed me on the couch days before, with the same economy and precision. Tiago was silent for a long time, long enough for me to wonder if I had gone too far, too fast, if I had pushed before he was ready and was about to pay the price I had come to know. When he spoke, his voice was still low, but solid, with the solidity of someone saying something true and recognizing it as they say it. I feel it, he said. 3 words, no flourishes, no qualifications, without the protection of a but at the end. With the same economy of words he used for everything he understood completely. I took another step closer. Me too, I said. What happened next doesn't need a detailed description. Not because it was unimportant, it was the opposite. But because the intimacy that truly matters doesn't need narration. It needs acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement had already happened. It was already complete in those few words exchanged in the yellow light of the workshop, with the old car's engine waiting to be finished and the city sleeping outside. What I can say is this. For the first time, both of us were on the same side of something true. No performance, no armor, without the mediation of gestures that had to be plausible enough not to raise suspicion. Just the two of us in that space that was Tiago's territory, where he was most completely himself. For that night, the small world stayed outside, and inside there was space. The next morning, the coffee maker was on when I went downstairs. The coffee was ready. The cup was turned upside down on the saucer next to the coffee maker, just like always. The ritual that had started without ceremony months ago and had settled into the daily life of the house as if it had always been there. Tiago had his back to me, in front of the stove, stirring something in a pan with the quiet care of someone in no rush. When I entered the kitchen, he turned his head slightly, not enough to look directly, just enough to confirm he'd heard my footsteps, that he knew who had walked in. Coffee, he said. I see it, I said. I served myself. I sat down. The morning routine continued. Tiago ate standing up, his plate on the counter, the way he always ate when he was in a hurry to get to the workshop before 8. I drank my coffee sitting down, looking out the window at the backyard, where the guava tree was getting heavy with fruit that no one had picked yet. There was no grand revelation, no deep conversation about the future, about what it meant, or what would come next, and how. Tiago was still Tiago, reserved, functional, economical with his words. The town was still Arinos beautiful and suffocating with its 15,000 inhabitants who knew each other by heart and guarded every family's history like collective property. Dona Hilda still existed, with the love that unintentionally stifled and the expectations he had never learned to renegotiate. None of that had disappeared. But there was a difference. The difference was in the 2 or 3 extra seconds Tiago spent looking at me before leaving, not avoiding, not performing indifference, just looking. The way you look at something you recognize, and that recognizes you back. In the way he said, "See you later," before grabbing his car keys. Not a generic, "See you later." Not the polite goodbye of someone on autopilot. A meaningful, "See you later," with weight. The kind of weight small words carry when they're actually being meant. The difference lay in the fact that neither of us was pretending anymore. Do you know the difference between something that is still going to happen and something that has already begun? How sometimes a beginning has no fanfare, no clean break, no clearly defined before and after. Sometimes it's just waking up one day and realizing the before is already behind you, that you're in the middle of something that doesn't have a name yet, but exists with the same certainty as named things, and that you got stuck in the middle of it without anyone ever announcing the transition. That's how it was. Tiago left for the workshop. I opened my laptop. I worked. Around noon, a text message arrived. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't the opening of a conversation that needed to be sustained. It was 4 words, simple and direct, just like he was. "Lunch is ready here." I looked at the message for a second. Then I typed, "I'm coming." And I went back to work. There were things that remained uncertain and would likely stay uncertain for some time. How to make that exist in a small town where everyone had an opinion about everyone else. What to say to Dona Hilda, and when, and if. What the two of them wanted this to become, when they were both ready to have that conversation without rushing. There was no perfect answer to any of those questions. There probably wouldn't be for a long while. But there was something more valuable than perfect answers. There was honesty. There were the two of them having stopped pretending at the same time, in the same place, without anyone needing to get hurt to get there. We had chosen to try, and that was more than any certainty. And there was lunch at noon. Too small to seem important. Too big to ignore. I go back to that Tuesday afternoon sometimes. To the sofa, to the remote, to the Amazon Prime screen, loading way too slowly. To the slight dizziness when the titles finally made sense. To the window, to the backyard, to the perfectly normal world outside. But what I see now is not what I saw at the time. At the time, what I saw was a history, a list of movies, a contradiction between what Tiago said and what Tiago did when he thought no one was watching. I saw the crack in the armor, and I just stood there in front of it, not knowing what to do. What I see now is different. I see a man who grew up in a town where certain things had to stay hidden. Not because he was weak, on the contrary. It took enormous strength to carry that, day after day, without faltering in his performance, without letting it slip in his voice or gestures, without giving anyone in Arinos a reason to doubt the image he had built. The movies he said he hated were the only places where he could see himself reflected, without anyone knowing he was looking. Stories of men who felt what he felt, who existed with the same intensity he did, but who existed out loud, on screen, with credits at the end. The only safe space he had found. And it was hidden in a streaming app, on a small screen, with the volume low, on nights when the house was quiet and the city was asleep. That watch history wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't a character flaw. It wasn't proof that Tiago had been deceiving me for months. It was a man using the only safe space he had found to be who he was, secretly, alone, without an audience, without judgment. And a 2-second lapse had exposed that space to me. I could have closed the app and never said a word. It would have been the safe choice for both of us, in different ways. The choice that would preserve the comfortable distance, that would keep the armor in place, that would leave each of us on the side of the wall we were already used to inhabiting. But I had learned, long ago, that things left unsaid have a weight. That the weight grows. That by the time it takes up too much space, you can no longer remember what it was like before it was there. There's something that stays with me from all of this. The idea of being seen. Not in a generic sense, not being seen as some abstract metaphor for validation or acceptance. Being seen in the most specific and most intimate sense. Having someone in front of you who knows something true about you, who doesn't use that thing against you, who doesn't pull back or push forward faster than you can keep up. Someone who stays. I see you. Tiago had given me that, without knowing it, for months, through the small gestures I unintentionally held on to. The coffee, the charger, the kitchen light left on. A specific, focused attention that existed beneath the polite distance, like a current beneath a still surface. And maybe what I had given back to him that night in the workshop was the same thing. Presence without demands. Recognition without judgment. A place where the armor could be set down without the world rushing into the space it left behind. This doesn't solve everything. I know. Everything out there, the town, the family, the unanswered questions, is still there. It's still real. There wasn't an easy ending waiting on the other side of the confession. But sometimes, enough isn't about solving everything. Sometimes, enough is a person who looks at you and instead of pretending they don't see, says, "I see you," and stays. If you've made it this far into the story, and I'm glad you have, you probably already recognize something of what I'm saying. Maybe you've also hidden things in histories that no one was supposed to see. Maybe you also know someone who wears their armor so well you believed in it for a long time. Or maybe you are that person, carrying the weight of something that never found a safe space to exist out loud. If anything in this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. You don't have to share everything. It could be a single sentence. It could just be, "I understand." This kind of story only truly makes sense when it reaches someone on the other side who also knows that weight. If you enjoyed this, leave a like. Your like helps this channel keep bringing stories like these, real, with psychological sensitivity, and without judgment. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss what's coming next. I see you. Until next time.